So I'll now introduce our author of today's Meet the Author session. Nathan G. Alexander holds a PhD in modern history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He was most recently a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies at the University of Erfurt in Germany. Nathan is the co-host of the Beyond Atheism Podcast, which discusses and debates what it means to be atheist and non-religious more broadly, both historically and in today's world. He is also, of course, the author of Race in a Godless World, Atheism, Race, and Civilization, 1850 to 1914, which was published in 2019 by NYU Press and also Manchester University Press. Nathan, thank you very much for being here today, and I will now turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren and Emma, for sort of setting this up and organizing it and everything. And thanks to everyone for coming, and looking forward to talking with you about my book. So I thought I would begin first by sort of talking a bit about why this topic, like why atheism and race. So the idea for the book first came when I was studying for my master's, actually, which was over 10 years ago now, which is kind of crazy. At the time, I was researching African history, but gradually I shifted to focus more and more on the history of racial thought, particularly in the 19th century. And during my studies, I noticed there were many points where race and religion intersected. Anti-Semitism, slavery, and imperial conquest were all bound up with Christianity. And yet, so too were abolition and attempts to protect the rights of indigenous people. Meanwhile, secular ideas about universal rights proliferated in the Enlightenment of the 18th century and afterwards. And yet, so too did attempts to divide up humanity into distinct races on a supposedly scientific basis, including through Darwinian evolution. So as I was reading, as I was sort of doing the master's research, I kept coming across questions like, did Darwin lead a path to Hitler? As there's one book that's got a title like that. Did the secular Enlightenment open the way to racism? Did Christianity end slavery and offer a check against racism? But despite all of these sort of questions, I realized that there was nothing specifically written about what atheists themselves thought about race, even though these debates often centered on the link between atheist thought and racism. So exploring this link is what I set out to do in my PhD that I did at University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and then the book. So in the book, I focused specifically on atheists and other freethinkers in Britain and the US from roughly 1850 to 1914. The theme of the book is complexity, ambivalence, shades of gray. I argue that on the one hand, white atheists and freethinkers imagined themselves as part of the most advanced civilizations on the planet, and they accepted current racial science about the superiority of the white race. But on the other hand, they were also skeptical about claims to innate racial and civilizational superiority, and they questioned imperial violence and racial prejudice. So in the talk, I'm going to kind of lay out these two kind of competing threads, and then also offer some thoughts I've had like since the publication of the book, which is about 2 years ago. I've got a couple of pictures to show you too, which should make things more interesting maybe. So just on the first part, many white atheists and freethinkers accepted scientific hierarchies of race with differing physical and mental traits what they saw as the cutting edge science of the time. But there was also a theological component as well. And this came particularly in their support for polygenesis, the idea that each human race had a separate origin. So polygenesis was in contrast to monogenesis, the idea that all human races had a single origin, and namely in Adam and Eve. So there's polygenesis and monogenesis. And atheists were interested in polygenesis since it seemed to directly challenge the truth of Christianity and the authority of the Bible, even if it meant getting into bed with scientific racists who wanted to emphasize the vast differences between races and that some races were inferior to others. So one example of this support for polygenesis is Charles Bradlaw. Some people might recognize that name. He was one of the leading atheists in 19th century Britain, and actually the first openly atheist member of parliament. So in some of his works, Bradlaw actually drew upon polygenesis and kind of research from leading scientific racists in order to make the case against Christianity. So his first goal was, it was really about a theological argument, but nonetheless, he was kind of indulging in racist ideas. And I also have a cartoon that can demonstrate this. So hopefully people can see this, I guess. Okay, so this is another kind of case where sort of polygenesis, kind of racist arguments kind of have a theological dimension. So this cartoon's by a cartoonist called Watson Heston. So basically, like, you can see the sort of upstanding white guy in the middle and surrounded by these kind of racial caricatures. And the point is to sort of say that in the Bible, it says God created man in his own image. But then the cartoon's kind of asking, well, which is the image, and, you know, how is it possible that there's such a diversity of races if this is true? And related again to polygenesis, like, how is it possible everyone could have descended from Adam and Eve, as it says in the Bible? So again, there's a sort of this racist dimension to the theological arguments. But another area where we can see scientific racism is in evolutionary arguments. Charles Darwin's theories of evolution were put forward in 1859 in his book On the Origin of Species. Darwin himself actually hated polygenesis and the way it seemed to justify slavery and racial violence. And his work argued for the common origin of all humanity and all species. But obviously others used his ideas to argue that certain races were at higher or lower stages of evolution, that some were closer or further from apes, or that certain races evolved from different ape ancestors and therefore were fundamentally separate. So obviously Darwin's ideas could be put toward racist ends. And on a social level, also racism sometimes creeps into atheist arguments. Non-white people were sometimes portrayed as primitive and superstitious. And by contrast, atheists often portrayed themselves as like very rational and incidental, or not incidentally white and male. So I've got another cartoon to show you if I can get this working. So yes, so hopefully this cartoon is visible. Again, it's from Watson Heston. And in this picture, on the right side is sort of this white father and son who are representing the free thought minority. And they're looking out against this like huge crowd of religious masses. And it's sort of interesting just because you can see on pretty front and center, there's sort of a stereotypical Native American guy and a Black guy as well, as part of these sort of credulous religious masses who the white free thinkers are kind of standing up against. But it's not the whole story of my book. It's talking about the sort of the racism of atheists. And I think actually one of the most interesting parts was how atheists actually challenged the racial assumptions of their times. And a key part of my argument here is that atheists at the time were a marginalized group. So atheists in Britain and the US were a stigmatized minority in the 19th century. They suffered a variety of legal and social penalties for their views. And what was more, many came from the working classes. So this meant they were shut out of power. They were shut out of mainstream, respectable society. They were outsiders. And this outsider perspective led them to look in new ways at the racial assumptions of their time. They found, for example, many positives in non-Western, non-white societies around the globe, and even in some ways identified with these people. Atheists and free thinkers sometimes wrote articles from the perspective of a non-white, non-Western person, someone say from Africa or from China. And in this way, they could critique their own societies and notice things that others might take for granted. And there was certain sort of cultural relativist angle to this kind of critique. For example, one writer in the British free thought newspaper, The National Reformer, wrote a series of articles in 1866, purportedly from a Chinese representative visiting England. And he ironically, for example, in these reports, he ironically called the English the barbarians and criticized the hypocrisy of Western Christians for mocking various Chinese religious rituals, when the Christian ones could hardly be called more rational. So this use of foreign personas was a valuable tool to criticize their societies, but it also maybe signals that some atheists saw themselves as outsiders within their own societies. And I've got another cartoon. Let me bring it up. Again, this is sort of about criticizing Western hypocrisy. So this is from Watson Heston again, who did the previous two cartoons. So you can see this on the left side. There's this, in the left panel, there's an American guy kind of giving a Chinese guy a hard time about Christian missionaries who were attacked in China. But then in the next panel, the Chinese guy is then saying like, well, you've got atrocities in your own country. And he's mentioning white Christians attacking Black people, like in a massacre. And then even on the sign, you can see just below the kind of picture there, he says, it's cruelties which would make barbarians blush. So again, there's sort of this cultural relativist kind of angle to critique one's own society and the hypocrisies there with regard to race. And sometimes atheists even drew explicit parallels between themselves and colonized people. For example, writing in the British newspaper, The Freethinker, one author lamented British imperialism in New Zealand and said, the infidel, like the Maori, is fighting the Christian for the common rights of humanity stolen from him. So this is a pretty interesting quote because they're specifically drawing parallels between sort of the fate of infidels in their society and then the Maori against the common enemy of the Christians. But atheists and non-religious people also spoke out against racism in their own societies. One example of this is the American Robert Ingersoll, one of the most famous freethinkers of the time, and maybe some people know him. So he spoke out against the movement to exclude the Chinese from the US, and also about the loss of civil rights for African Americans in the decades after the Civil War. So in one speech in 1883, Ingersoll said, quote, I am the inferior of any man whose rights I trample underfoot. Men are not superior by reason of the accidents of race or color. They are superior who have the best heart, the best brain. And another example is the white atheist James F. Morton Jr., who wrote a book in 1906 called The Curse of Race Prejudice. And there he attacked race prejudice as a silly superstition. And he drew parallels between race prejudice and other superstitions like a belief in witches or a fear of the number 13. So in this way, Morton's atheism and his commitment to rationality actually informed his sort of critique of race prejudice. It was just another irrational belief. So it was true that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were atheists and free thinkers who accepted racial pseudoscience about white superiority. Definitely that's true. And I definitely talk about that in the book. But there was also a strong current of thought opposing racism among atheists. And atheists in the 19th century were often more progressive on racial issues than their Christian counterparts. And I came across in my research many views that are really radical on racial issues and are far outside the mainstream at the time. So why was this so? I argue that in the 19th century, the fact that atheists were marginalized, that they were outsiders, led them to be more willing to question central features of their society, things that everyone else took for granted. And in the 19th century, obviously this included racism and ideas about the superiority of white Western society. But in addition to this outsider status, there are other qualities that often are part of an atheist worldview that could lead one to anti-racist conclusions. And these include a commitment to rationality, science, and skepticism, and a hostility to authoritarianism, dogmatism, and tradition. Another common element of atheist thinking is a willingness to be a contrarian, a willingness to break taboos. And while this contrarian disposition led some atheists in the 19th century to question racism, in the conclusion to the book, I suggested that today, actually, this contrarian streak can sometimes have paradoxical effects. For some, being an atheist is no longer enough to demonstrate one's commitment to taboo breaking and contrarianism. And this can have the effect of today leading some people to actually entertain ideas of racial difference simply because it seems to go against the social consensus. And in the conclusion, I specifically talked about links between the alt-right and secularists or atheists. And I think this is sort of an important change from previously when far-right movements would maybe be more explicitly Christian, like the Ku Klux Klan, for example. And also in the conclusion, I noted that there seemed to be an interest among some secular people in things like IQ differences between racial groups and genders as well. But perhaps like a more pressing and more mainstream issue that I might have discussed is the rise of so-called anti-wokeness. And I think this reaction against so-called wokeness leads to the support of like regressive policies like we've seen recently about banning discussions of so-called critical race theory, and might lead to support of people like Trump, for example. And it seems that actually the descendants of the new atheist movement have had an important role in this anti-wokeness movement. So examples include people like Dave Rubin, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, James Lindsay, Majid Nawaz, and others that might be familiar names to some people. Having said that, in the 2020 US presidential election, we know that about 3/4 of atheists and non-religious people voted for the Democrats. And furthermore, contemporary numbers suggest that atheists and other non-religious people appear the most racially tolerant. For example, an article by the political scientist Ryan Burge finds that in the US, atheists and agnostics score lowest in racial resentment scores compared to other religious demographics. So just to sort of wrap up, I guess, just to say, I think probably with most authors, I hope that my book isn't sort of the last word. I hope it's more of sort of a starting point that other people can build on and or criticize or completely overturn. So anyway, thanks for listening, and definitely looking forward to discussing this more with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nathan. So what I will do right now is I'm just going to quickly share a link to the book in the chat. And then if anyone has a question or comment, please just indicate this in the chat, and I'll prompt you again to unmute yourself. You can just simply write to I have a question or I have a comment. And Megan, I see your hand up right now, so I think that means you have a question, if you want to go ahead and ask it.
Thank you for your presentation and the book, Nathan. Of course, I study anti-Semitism, so it's interesting for me. And you mentioned that in the introduction we read. Your work focuses more on the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, but do you have any knowledge, unless I missed this in the chapter, do you have any knowledge about racism, anti-Semitism, hate amongst atheists today?
Today, I mean, I think just what I was sort of saying in the conclusion, that I think on the whole, it seems that atheists are more progressive on issues of race, but I think there's sort of a vocal minority, very vocal, who are sort of leading this charge. Even you know, more kind of anti-wokeness, sort of like anti-left-wing stuff, and I've even heard it said like anti-racism. So it's sort of like yeah. But then you also see, I mean, like in the book I talked about the links with the alt-right, and Richard Spencer, who is one of the leaders of the alt-right movement, identifies as an atheist. And so I do think there's definitely there's still a story to be told about the links between atheism and race today, but it wasn't my main focus. I talked a little bit about it in the introduction. Yeah. Or sorry, in the conclusion, I should say. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Megan. So we have a question in the chat too, which I will just read. So what made you come to the conclusion that the reason why many atheists stood up against scientific racism was because they were marginalized minority, but not other reasons?
I think it's because, well, sometimes they say it kind of explicitly, that they draw parallels between themselves and between themselves and non-white people or non-Western people. They explicitly say that they've got this common enemy of sort of Christian oppressors, we'll say. I think another thing is that atheists at the time often saw the perpetrators of racist violence as Christian. And I mean, I don't know, I mean, for example, like in discussions of lynching in the late 19th century, sometimes atheists will say, you know, it was really Christians who were entirely behind all this lynching. And so I think the fact that they saw themselves as kind of not sort of separate from the people in power who are Christians. Whether that's totally true is another sort of story, like whether their impressions were accurate, like whether it really was all Christians there who are participating in these lynchings. Nonetheless, like they sort of saw it in that way. And I think, yeah, I mean, I feel like sometimes the cultural relativist angle, where they are really kind of criticizing their own societies at a time when it was fairly commonly accepted that like white Western society was the pinnacle of civilization, whatever. They didn't really think so, because they were so discriminated against. So how could it be true that white Western society was so great? And I think that does kind of lead them to look in a different way at this issue of racism. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Is there another comment or question?
Hi, thank you so much, Nathan, for your presentation. Yeah, what do you think about this claim from Christian camp that comes that, behind the abolitionist movement in the US and in particular in the Great Britain stood mainly like Christians. So it wasn't a rational movement. It wasn't like reason and, enlightenment behind these, but, vice versa, especially in the US, it was Calvinism, which is very, very conservative kind of movement. Do you have any data on that? And thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know as much about the British case, but I definitely think like there is a lot of truth to say that Christianity, and specifically specific sects of Christianity, like the Quakers, for example, played an important role in the abolition of slavery. So I do think that's true, but I also think there were a lot of, if not explicitly atheists, there were a lot of kind of religiously unorthodox people who were involved in abolitionist movements in the US. And well, one example is William Lloyd Garrison in the US, who's probably one of the most well-known figures in the abolitionist movement. He was definitely a Christian, but I think his religious views were quite unorthodox. And he actually, the interesting thing was he, one of the places where he was able to speak, because it was really difficult for him to get a platform to speak in the 1830s, because obviously it was such an explosive issue. He was given a place to speak at this guy called Abner Neeland's, I guess it was sort of a church, although by this point Neeland was pretty much a non-believer. So he offered a platform for Garrison to speak. And you have other examples of free thinkers who were involved with the abolitionist movement. Ernestine Rose, for example, in the US, some people might know her. She was a very prominent speaker against slavery and for women's rights as well. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, someone else who's pretty well known, I think, who was an abolitionist but also a free thinker. And I mean, there's many examples really of free thinkers who are involved, but definitely it is true though that specific denominations of Christianity also played really important parts. And partly, I guess it's also that free thinkers were a very tiny minority, which also sort of explains why that there's not as many of them. And just one other point too, I guess, is there's probably kind of Enlightenment, sort of secular defenses of rights and things like that come in the 18th century, which also probably helped further the cause of abolitionism.
That's awesome, thank you. So we have another question in the chat, which I will read out loud. Nathan, if you have any thoughts, and this is an interesting one, so if anyone else has thoughts too, I'd be interested to hear them. So thank you, Leo, for this. I am wondering about the role of where anti-racist voices fit into power dynamics in a society. Is power in one's position in the power structures more important than either religion or non-religion as categories?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess, yeah, I mean, I'd also be interested to hear what other people think, but I guess tentatively, I might say maybe it's not kind of an either or question because I think, especially in the 19th century, being able to be, being non-religious did kind of shut you out of power structures. So I don't think you can sort of make it like an either or question. but I do think that it's an interesting thing because I think, yeah, I think obviously that at the same time, like anti-racist voices, I suppose, were pretty marginalized in the 19th century, and yeah, yeah. I'll sort of say that tentatively, but if someone else wants to jump in, that would be, yeah, be interested in that too.
Leo, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me just get myself unmuted here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm working on a project on religious literacy, and so I'm rethinking definitions of religion and literacy, and I'm thinking about religion in terms of people's kind of ultimate point of loyalty, or their kind of how they structure their meaning frameworks. So I'm questioning or interrogating the religious versus secular divide, because I'm just wondering about the significance of the categories of religion versus non-religion, and thinking that no matter what your religious category is, your ultimate loyalty may be to a particular power structure. You might be Christian or not Christian, but that may be less important than your need to keep your slave system going because you own slaves, or because your brother-in-law does, or I mean, you can apply the same thing to the way we think about gender, or I'm not sure about that, but I'm trying this one out, questioning the categories of religion, non-religion, atheist versus whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I think there's sort of a class dimension as well, like you were mentioning, that there's other kind of ways to think about power and so on. And it happened that like many atheists were from the working classes, but as you sort of, there's also kind of middle class atheists as well, and you seem to see more let's say like conservative attitudes toward race. For example, I mean, one case that just sort of comes to mind is Thomas Henry Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, and I'm just trying to remember exactly, but I think in the American Civil War, I'm not sure if he, yeah, I should really know this given that I wrote about it, but but he does sort of express some kind of racist views with regard to the American Civil War, like to the issue of emancipation. So I do think, like, in addition to like religion, like another angle is this class thing. And if you do have a more of an interest in, say, sort of preserving this particular division of power, I suppose, like that definitely informs your views as well, like aside from religion or not.
Okay, I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in there, but yeah.
Maybe I'll just read Hannah's comment in the chat too about this. Let's see. So something I'm considering is the ways in which atheist or non-religious white people who were marginalized or othered in the 19th century still had more power comparatively to racialized groups. With this in mind, could power structures be seen as more important?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult thing. I mean, it's again, I suppose it's sort of a intersectional thing where it's not clear, like, it's not like race trumps religion or vice versa or something. It sort of needs to be considered holistically. But one thing I would just say, I mean, that obviously my own focus in the book was for the most part white white atheists, but obviously there were atheists of color too, who I talk a little bit about in the book, African-American atheists, and even Chinese-American atheists, for example. So I do think, yeah, it's a difficult question. Like, I think it depends sometimes. One case I mentioned at some point in the book, there was a Black Christian evangelist, or for lack of a better word, who was sort of in Britain, who was fairly popular and was sort of attacking atheists, and atheists were sort of fighting back against him. So I mean, in a case like that, it's not necessarily clear who has more power. I mean, it maybe depends on particular context. Like sometimes atheists may have less power, and sometimes, or I should say white atheists, and sometimes Black Christians might have more, depending on the context. Yeah, I think the thing is, yeah, thinking about it in sort of a holistic way, and also on given particular situations, I suppose.
Great, thank you, Hannah. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on this topic. Okay, I will use this opportunity to ask my question, and then if anyone has something else to add or say, please feel free to leave it in the chat. I'm wondering, kind of on the topic of categories too and self-identification, Nathan, you'd mentioned when we were talking just before the webinar, you kind of use atheism or atheist as an umbrella term, but a lot of people identify too as free thinkers during this period. So I guess I'm wondering, one, if you could talk a little bit about your decision in using atheist as that umbrella category, because obviously this is something that's kind of discussed in literature on non-religion and kind of what terms people use. And then two, when you kind of see free thinker being used, and if and when this shifts and changes into another category or self-identity such as atheist.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, thank you for that question. It's true, I do kind of use atheist as an umbrella category, even though maybe some or many of the people I talk about may not even want to use that that category to describe themselves. I think the reason was partly or mostly a practical one. Initially, I had been, like when I was working on my PhD, I was talking about like free thinkers and race. But then the problem was that, the reason was because many people in the 19th century that was the term they used. They called themselves free thinkers. But the problem was, whenever I sort of explained it to someone like my topic, they didn't know what free thinker meant. And so the reason was sort of partly or mostly practical, that it's just easier to get the idea across to people reading the book or hearing about it, what it's about. But I think there's also kind of a legitimate reason, I suppose, for using that. In that, I think one way you could talk about atheist is that they live as if there's no God, or they don't really. It's not something they think about. So for example, in the 19th century, is also when you get agnostics, like that term is coined in the 19th century as well. But the agnostic position, I guess, is that you can't know whether there's a God or not. But in practical terms, they basically live as if there's no God, and they they don't live in a way that there's an equal chance that God exists or doesn't exist. And that was an argument that atheists in the 19th century made to kind of criticizing the agnostics, that they were just kind of covering up their atheism by calling themselves agnostics. Maybe in a perfect world, maybe I would have used the word or the term free thinker, because like I said, that is what many people call themselves. I think there's a lot of like, it maybe allows for more diversity in terms of non-religious positions. even encompassing people who might be like deists, like they believe in kind of a creator God who created the universe, but then doesn't intervene anymore. Aside from that, and also like spiritualists, people who kind of believed in people that you could contact the dead or something like that. So I'm not sure exactly when free thinker kind of disappears as a term. Probably at some point into the mid 20th century. I think like to some extent today, probably atheist has been a bit rehabilitated, I think, from some of the negative connotations that existed before. And you also have in the 20th century, humanist comes out as a term as well, which is maybe a more kind of positive connotations perhaps than atheist. But I do think like the issue of terminology and like the different labels people use for themselves is pretty interesting issue. And I've written a little bit about that, like in other places, other like journal articles and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering too, in part because I think someone correct me if I'm wrong too. I believe it's Callum Brown, who is a historian as well, also uses the term atheist as kind of his umbrella category. Yeah, so thank you for your answer. Does anyone else have a question or comment right now?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on Leo and Hannah and throw gender into the mix, and not just, sort of thinking, oh, let's identify some women to talk about in your story, but just thinking about the overall category of gender and what you might have to say about how gender plays into the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Probably if I was writing the book again, I would probably focus more on that issue than I did. But I do think it does play out in a number of different ways, aside from, like you saying, just mentioning a bunch of free thinking women to talk about, to add to the story. I think there's something about, well, I like in some of the cartoons I showed that atheism, whiteness, and masculinity are all sort of like, and like rationality are all sort of bound up, whereas sort of religion and we'll say non-whiteness, for lack of a better term, and also like kind of like emotion, sort of superstition are kind of bound up in a sort of opposition to that. So I think that's sort of an interesting thing that I might have maybe explored more. I mean, another thing, another thing that this plays out, I mean, obviously there's a whole bunch of literature about the ways race and gender are kind of interlinked. But for example, in discussions of slavery, when white atheists and freethinkers are talking about slavery and and so on, it's interesting because they often talk about like the horrors of slavery. They'll often use kind of like a female slave as like an example of the horrors of slavery. So there's another cartoon in the book that shows a slave woman being sort of at a slave auction, and she's standing on a Bible, like as the auction block is the Bible. So I think there's something about that as well, that when they're trying to give a sort of sympathetic picture of someone who's not white, they go for sort of a feminine example rather than a masculine one, because maybe it sort of makes them less threatening or more sympathetic or something like that. So I do think like there's a lot of different ways that gender plays into the story, and Yeah, I mean, I do talk about that in the book, but if I was to do it again, I would probably explore those issues more, I think. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking too, when you were answering Laurie's question, I don't know if someone else would have thoughts on this, but I think women too are often portrayed as being more religious. So I wonder how that factors into. And we have another comment from Leo. I have been thinking about this in terms of hierarchies of rationality in ways that privileges white male supremacy. Gender is very important in this discussion. Comment.
Yeah, I think definitely that's true. I mean, I think there's also probably more complicating factors as well. I mean, because obviously there were there were free-thinking women who definitely also were portrayed themselves as rational and so on. Actually, I should mention, like, there's an interesting book by I think the name is Evelyn Kirkley. It's called I think it's called Rational Mothers and Infidel Gentlemen. It came out maybe like 20 years ago or something like that. Some people maybe have heard of it, but it does sort of like it talks about the same time period as me roughly, but it does talk about yeah, like the issue of gender more specifically in the 19th century. And I think it does kind of, if I can sort of remember from the book, it's been a while since I read it, but there is something about, that like this idea of like a rational motherhood, and that they have like women have an important role to play in sort of like transmitting rationality to the next generation as mothers. Yeah, but yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out that book. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just shared a link to what I believe is the book you had just mentioned for anyone who wants to check it out.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, we have time for one more quick comment or question. All right. Actually, what I'll do right now too, Nathan, is I'll share a link to your podcast as well, Beyond Atheism, for those who want to also check that out.
Yes.
So I'll just pull that up. If anyone has another quick comment or question, please jump in. All right, there we go. Okay, so yeah, we're a few minutes early, but that's okay. So we can just wrap up. Yeah, Nathan, if you have any final comments to add, please feel free. Otherwise, yeah, I'll just say thank you to all of our participants for coming today. And obviously, Nathan, many thanks to you for taking the time to be here and share talk about your book with us and sharing those cartoons. That was really great to see. And yeah, this was a great topic, I think, to kind of start off the webinar series this year. Yes. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming and for the interesting questions. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, and thanks everybody else. It's good to see you.
Awesome. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.